Hello everybody, welcome back to another election prediction video. This time we're going to do a fun one. I was thinking about doing a 2028 Democratic primary video. I think that would be quite the interesting one, and I kind of think it'll boil down to these top six candidates here. We have Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, Ocasio-Cortez. That's a big maybe if she would run in 2028. I think it's possible. So that's why I put her in as this candidate. Plus, we need someone on the progressive left to be the stand-in here. So I think making it Ocasio-Cortez would just make the most sense. Warren could also be arguably on the progressive left, but then again, she didn't really drop out of the race when it was clear she wasn't going to win. So I think Ocasio-Cortez, I think we're going to see someone like her, or someone similar to her in policies, run as the progressive stand-in here. We have Kamala Harris, the current Vice President of the United States. I think she's definitely going to run in 2028. We have Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. I think she's very certain to run. Warren, I think she probably decides to run, but we'll see what happens. And Raphael Warnock from Georgia. I think he would probably consider running as well. But let's just get right into it. So the first state in the Democratic primary is South Carolina. So in South Carolina, it's going to be pretty much a heavy Harris state. I think Harris would be very favored to win here. The real question is, how many candidates get to 15% of the statewide vote to get statewide delegates? I think that Warnock would probably at least get like 20% of the vote. I think Ocasio-Cortez will get at least 18% as the progressive stand-in, while Newsom and Whitmer and Warren are all like below 15%. Warren probably does a bit worse, only gets 5%. So I could see Whitmer doing a bit worse. Same with Newsom. I think they would all get around like 9 or 7% of the vote, while Harris gets about 40%. But since they didn't get over 15, they probably didn't get over 15 in most of these districts, and we have to reallocate these delegates. So put 6 to Harris and the other 3 to Warnock and Ocasio-Cortez. So Harris has already started out with a pretty decent delegate lead out of South Carolina. So I could see Cortez doing a bit worse here and giving another delegate towards Harris. But already she starts off with a lead just because the calendar kind of favors her early on. So going on to the state of New Hampshire, I see this as a state that'll probably go to Ocasio-Cortez. I think she'll do fairly well here. I could also see Whitmer getting enough delegates, and I could see Warren just managing enough delegates to get to 15%, while Harris gets about second in this state. Not that far behind from Ocasio-Cortez, but she gets a decent win in the state. In Nevada, this is a really tough one. I think Newsom would probably edge it out here because he is from California. It is very close in proximity, so you have a bit of a geographic advantage here. So I'd give this a narrow Gavin Newsom victory. Well, I think Ocasio-Cortez and Harris, I think, probably narrowly edges out Cortez here for second place. And the rest of these delegates, again, they split it up if you're below 15, so who could I potentially see grabbing at least a delegate or two? I could see Warnock potentially getting one delegate. But other than that, these other delegates are just going to get reallocated to the top 3 here. So Newsom gets a win, Ocasio-Cortez gets a win, and Harris gets a win. Going on to the state of Michigan, I think Whitmer is very favored to win this state, and Harris and Cortez will probably get into the top 3 yet again, while Warnock and Warren continue to get not a lot of delegates. Honestly, maybe Warren gets at least one delegate. I could see her getting 15% in like at least a couple districts. So I'd give her about 2 delegates. Warnock, I really don't think so. I think most black voters would probably head towards Harris at this point, so I think he would get 0. Whitmer, again, I think she'd do pretty well, probably getting in like the 41% range of the popular vote in her home state of Michigan. Harris, on the other hand, I think she'll get around 23%. Ocasio-Cortez, probably about 19, and Newsom is unlucky. He doesn't get to 15%, but he will win at least some district delegates, so I put him at about 5 delegates. Now these delegates will get reallocated. I think Whitmer would get about 5 of them because she is in first place. Harris will get 3 each, and so will Ocasio-Cortez. So Whitmer gets a fair amount of delegates, and she's now tied for second in place in delegates with Ocasio-Cortez. So we're getting to the more interesting part, Super Tuesday. So at this point, I think Warren and Warnock will both drop out. I see Warren. I think she doesn't want to repeat the same mistake she did last time and stayed and sabotage Sanders. I think at this point, I think I could see her endorsing Ocasio-Cortez and Warnock. I think he'll use this to his advantage. He'll look at the candidates in the race, and I think he'll probably end up endorsing Gretchen Whitmer here in the hopes of getting a VP position. Whitmer would probably convince Warnock to probably offer that VP deal to him, and he would probably go in ahead and endorse her. So we have Warren endorsing Cortez and Warnock endorsing Whitmer. I kind of just see it that playing out that specific way. I don't think Warnock would endorse Harris because I think he would see it more electorally viable to endorse Whitmer, who actually has a chance at winning. Because I just think Harris is a pretty weak candidate, and I think Warnock would probably realize that and endorse Whitmer instead. So now there's 4 candidates race: Newsom, Ocasio-Cortez, Harris, and Whitmer. So we're going to start off with the northeastern states. I think Ocasio-Cortez would be very favored to win in the state of Vermont. I think Harris at least gets third, while Whitmer gets second, and Newsom gets no delegates because he doesn't reach 15%. In the state of Massachusetts, with that Warren endorsement, I think Ocasio-Cortez is in a very good spot to win the state. Newsom, I don't think he reaches 15% delegates, but I think he wins some district delegates, so I think I'd give him about 4 delegates or so. Harris, on the other hand, I don't think she gets second here. I think Whitmer narrowly edges her out for second place. In Maine, I think everyone at least gets some statewide delegates here, so I'm giving some to Newsom, but I think he gets fourth. Harris gets third, and Whitmer gets, I would say, second. I think she would get some momentum behind her with an endorsement. And I could see maybe if Klobuchar's in the race, her endorsing Whitmer. So I think that would help her with the more moderate types of Democrats, or just more Midwestern ones. Again, Klobuchar did well in New Hampshire, so maybe that endorsement could potentially help Whitmer here. But I see kind of going like this in Maine. I think Ocasio-Cortez would be pretty favored to win here. So I think we should head down into the southern states where I think Harris is just going to sweep them. So starting off with Alabama, I don't think Gavin Newsom gets any delegates. I think Cortez gets third place here. Whitmer gets second, while Harris just wins overwhelmingly in the state of Alabama by a pretty decent margin. But I would just give her a bit more delegates, Whitmer, because she would have that Warnock endorsement. So moving on to the state of Tennessee, it would be a bit better for Whitmer. I think she would get in like the high 20s, while Ocasio-Cortez only gets like 23% or something. Newsom doesn't get any statewide delegates. I don't think he reaches 15%, but I think he'll get a delegate somewhere in a random district. Well, Harris gets the rest. The state of Arkansas, I think Harris would do a bit worse here, while Whitmer would get second place again. Ocasio-Cortez would get third place here. And this last delegate, I don't think Newsom would get a district delegate, so I'll just give it to the winner in Harris. The state of Virginia, I think Whitmer would make a serious play for this state, and she would make it pretty decently close. But I do think she would at least get second place, probably around 30% of the delegates. Newsom would get some district delegates, but not above that 15% threshold. Ocasio-Cortez probably gets about 25% of the delegates, while Harris ends up winning the state of Virginia by 40%. In North Carolina, I think Harris would do a bit better in this state. Newsom, I don't think gets statewide delegates again, but I think he wins some district delegates here and there, getting 15% in some congressional districts. I'll put him at about 3. Whitmer, again, I think should probably end up getting second place in the state, while Cortez gets third, so she gets some delegates out of there. In the state of Oklahoma and Texas, I think we'll do Texas first. I think Ocasio-Cortez actually gets second place here. I think she would do well with Latino voters in the state of Texas, but I think Harris overall would still end up winning the state. Whitmer, I think, would get about not that far behind in third place, while Newsom would get some district delegates, probably a bit less than 9. I think it'd go down to about 6. Just give one each to everybody. If I could work the slider correctly, it's pretty tough. Okay, so I think that's how the district or this delegates would split in that state. In the state of Oklahoma, I think this is one state that Whitmer would probably fare the best in. It's a more conservative-ish state, and I don't think Harris would do. I don't think Harris would win here. I think it's a real contest between AOC and Whitmer, but I think Whitmer would narrowly edge out AOC in the state just by about 6%, while Harris is in about third, and Newsom again doesn't get enough statewide delegates, but he'll at least get ahead in one district and get at least a single delegate out of there. Get at least 15%, I think. I'll give him about 2. And the rest of these delegates, I think I would boost up Whitmer a bit more and DOC. Okay, so Whitmer at least got one win so far. In the state of Iowa, I also think this would probably be another win for her. It's in the Midwest states, but I think it would be between AOC and Whitmer, but I think Whitmer would just narrowly edge out AOC yet again. Newsom, I think, actually gets statewide delegates for once, while Harris gets into third place. Minnesota, I think, will be a contest between Whitmer and AOC. Klobuchar endorsing Whitmer potentially here would probably definitely help. But with Warren dropping out of the race, endorsing Ocasio-Cortez, the progressive left is unified here. I think AOC probably takes a win in Minnesota against Whitmer. But it'll be a very close contest. And again, I don't think Newsom qualifies for statewide delegates here, but I think he'll win some district delegates because he'll at least get 15% in some places, and Harris gets third. So moving on to the state of Colorado, I would probably give this would probably be a pretty interesting split here. I think Newsom probably would actually qualify for delegates here, get about 15%. Harris probably gets, again, third place. And Ocasio-Cortez, I see her getting a pretty decently sized victory here. Whitmer would probably get second, I would argue. In Utah, I think, again, Newsom would get some statewide delegates here. Harris would probably end up getting third. Whitmer would probably get... I just lower Harris's numbers here a bit. But I think Harris and Whitmer probably would get pretty close to second. They'd probably tie. But I think... Let me just reallocate. I think Whitmer would get second here. In the state of California, I think Newsom would probably end up winning his home state, and Harris gets second, and Ocasio-Cortez is in a very close third with Harris. But I think Newsom probably gets about 36%. I think Whitmer would get some not statewide delegates. I don't think she breaches 15%. She'll get some district delegates. Ocasio-Cortez, just like 1% behind Harris. I think it would be a very clean three-way split here. American Samoa, it's a random state, but you could see AOC pulling this one off while Harris gets second. And let's just throw a random delegate for Newsom. I think you would probably get a random one there. So looking at this map, I think just based on how Newsom performed, he already hit 200 delegates. I think Newsom probably would drop out at this point, but he would retain his delegates, and he would see a contested conventions very likely. So I just think he would probably end up dropping out at this point. I don't really see him staying in much longer. So let's just see the next few states here. What's in the schedule? So we have Hawaii, Dems abroad. All right, so these are 2 easy wins for AOC. I think Whitmer would probably stay in a bit longer. She at least won multiple states instead of just Newsom winning one of his own home states. So I think Whitmer would probably do fairly decent here, but I think AOC would come in large part the winner here. And it would probably put Harris at getting second. Dems abroad, again, it's a more progressive-leaning voting bloc, so I'd have Harris probably doing a bit worse than Whitmer here. I think Whitmer would outperform her narrowly. So moving on, we got Georgia, Mississippi, Northern Marinas Caucasus, and Washington State. Again, I think the caucus here would probably go to AOC, while Harris gets second. In Georgia, I think Harris would probably end up winning. I think Whitmer would actually get third place here. I think the progressive left would be a bit more unified between AOC at this point. Mississippi, I could see this being a state where it's more conservative leaning. So I think AOC would do a bit worse than Whitmer in this state. But overall Harris gets a win. Let's see. We got Washington State. So I think AOC again would probably end up winning this state. Whitmer would do decent. She would get like third place, but only like 20% of the delegates. Harris would get about second place, I would say. I think Whitmer continues to stay in probably till a lot of these the 5 states down here: Arizona, Illinois, Kansas, Ohio, and Florida would be in here if it wasn't canceled in 2024. But in Florida, I think AOC would probably get second place. Whitmer again only gets like 20% of the delegates. Harris ends up winning here because AOC and Whitmer splitting the vote with each other against Harris. I think Whitmer again would get like 20% of the delegates. AOC would get about probably a bit close behind Harris, but Harris still wins by like 9. Illinois, again, I think this state would probably go to Harris, but I think AOC at least breaches 30%. Whitmer would probably get around 21%. We'll just split the delegates pretty evenly between the top two here. What's next? Kansas, Arizona. Okay, so I think these states are probably both going to go to AOC, but I think Whitmer would do a bit better in Kansas, but still third. And Whitmer again would get third in Arizona. At this point, yeah, just put it to AOC. At this point, I think Whitmer would probably end up dropping out of the race. She's already reached 540 delegates, so that's enough for a contested convention if this race keeps on going. And it wouldn't be good to stay in the race if you just keep losing states. It would hurt your presidential prospects in the future, which is why Newsom would have dropped out early. And I think Whitmer would drop out at this point as well because she just keeps getting third place in a lot of these states. So let's move on to the next few states: Louisiana and Missouri, which I think probably both would be Harris victories. I think she would get a pretty large one in Louisiana, while Missouri's a bit closer. I think AOC at least gets 43% here. Well, I would actually even put it a bit closer, 54-45. Again, Sanders did well in this state back in 2016, but Biden beat him by a pretty big margin. So I think Harris would probably get a victory here against AOC because progressives typically don't win in Missouri. They could make it close, but they typically don't win. North Dakota, this is definitely an AOC primary victory. She gets a big one here. Delaware would probably be in these 4 primaries here: Connecticut, New York, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin. And I would put Delaware in here as well. But I think AOC, this is going to be very fertile territory for her in the Northeast. I think she'll get a lot of victories here. Even in New York, I think she would win by a pretty big margin. In Connecticut, I also think she'd get a win, but it'll be a bit closer than Rhode Island and New York. Delaware, on the other hand, I think Harris would be very favored to win. It's a very establishment state. Wisconsin, I think AOC would get a victory here against Harris, probably 60-40 split. So AOC's now got some momentum behind her. We'll see if that's enough to catch up and pledge delegates. Alaska and Wyoming are next, and I think these are both progressive states in the primary, so I think AOC would do pretty well in both of them, but Wyoming would be a bit closer because, again, in 2016, it was very close between Hillary and Sanders, even though Sanders ended up winning here. But Wyoming's a less of a progressive state than Alaska is in the primary, but still leans kind of more left-wing than establishment. So we have Pennsylvania, Puerto Rico, and Indiana up next. I think Pennsylvania would actually go to AOC. I think the more populous types of voters would go to her. Puerto Rico, again, I think she would do very well with Latino voters, probably end up winning in a landslide in Puerto Rico. Well, Indiana, I think, with it being open primary, I think independents would go to AOC against Harris. Then we have Maryland, Nebraska, and West Virginia. I think Maryland is definitely going to go to Harris here. West Virginia, I think it being a more anti-establishment state, I think it ends up going to AOC, but not by a huge margin. They usually vote for a protest candidate there, typically. Nebraska, on the other hand, I think would also go to AOC again. Then we have Kentucky and Oregon. I actually think both these states end up going to AOC. Kentucky would be a bit of a closer one because, again, this is actually a very close race back in the 2016 primary, but I think AOC would narrowly edge out Harris here. I'm pretty sure it's only Democrats allowed to vote here as well, so that would probably hurt AOC a bit. but I think she would narrowly edge out Harris still. And the state of Oregon, I think this state would definitely go to AOC. So look how close the pledged delegates is, 1380 to 1389 in the last few states. So we have Idaho up next, and I think Idaho probably ends up going to AOC, but be about 60-40 split. And then I just have these last few primaries here. So I think DC probably ends up going to Harris by a pretty large margin. New Jersey, it's more of an establishment state, so I think Harris would win here by about 56-43. I think that would be a pretty fair amount. I think AOC probably ends up winning these last few states. Let me just fill them out now. I think she would also end up winning in Montana and New Mexico because Latino voters would probably go to AOC here by a pretty decent amount. Guam, I think, would end up going to AOC. Well, the Virgin Islands, it's more establishment territory, so I think it would go massively in favor of Harris. And we have a situation where no one has a majority of the pledged delegates. So I think Whitmer is the real kingmaker here because Newsom's delegates, that's not enough to bring you above, I'm pretty sure it's 1,900 delegates or so. Let's see. 1968 delegates needed to win. So you need 1,968 delegates. So let's just bring out the super delegates really to orchestrate this. They only vote if it's not decided on the pledged delegate ballot. But let's see here. So let's allocate the 541 delegates. Let's say, I think Whitmer will probably end up, I don't know. Would she actually go for Harris or AOC? It would have to be a VP offer. It would have to make her decide to go that way. So if she were to go to AOC, let's see, 541, would that reach the number? Yeah, it would reach the number. So she would decide who would win here. So I think Whitmer would look at the general election of which one of AOC or Harris is polling better against the Republican nominee. And based on that, I think AOC would probably be in a better spot than Harris is because AOC would probably do better with independent voters than Harris would. AOC is more likable than Harris. So I think Whitmer would be like, if you give me a VP spot, AOC, then I'll let my delegates go to you. So I think at the end of the day, I think Whitmer would decide that AOC is probably more electable in the general election. So I think AOC would probably end up winning the 2020 Democratic primary or someone like her running for the progressives. But I think Whitmer would look at electability. I think that would be the biggest concern. But other than that, that's my take on the 2028 Democratic primary. It is a bit early to do this, but I think this would be a fun video. I was inspired to do this at a community post that I saw. But yeah, I just think AOC would probably end up winning the primary. But Whitmer is the person who decides. So if Whitmer wants Harris, then Harris is it. So I think it's solely dependent on who Whitmer wants to be the nominee. But other than that, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.